Everyone believed Rex was beyond saving. Even a billionaire's fortune couldn't buy the trust of a dog scarred by the past. But Lily, a 12-year-old without home or family, walked alone to his gate with nothing but courage. She asked for no money, only a chance to belong. What happened would leave even the cold billionaire in tears. Like this story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind came down from the hills with the clean smell of mesquite and dust brushing the high fencing of the Harrison canine grounds until the chain links hummed like a distant tuning fork. On the ridge above the kennels stood the main house, stone cedar wide eaves to keep out Texas heat, its windows holding the long light of late afternoon the way a man holds his breath. Mr. Harrison watched from the western porch, hat in hand, shoulders squared by habit more than pride. He had made and lost fortunes in a world of circuits and contracts, and when the noise of that world grew too loud, he bought land and filled it with dogs. People in town said he liked them because they didn't argue. That wasn't the truth. He liked them because they told the truth with their eyes, and the truth didn't dodge or gild. On the porch table lay a folded notice, the ink still new, the corners pinned down by a battered pocket knife. The headline was plain, almost old-fashioned. Public Notice, Humane Rehabilitation Challenge. Below it in lines Mr. Harrison had edited and re-edited, past midnight, were terms that made handlers raise their eyebrows and lawyers clear their throats. Substantial reward upon successful proof of gentling an aggressive animal documented over multiple sessions. No coercive tools, no stimulants, no tricks that hid fear under obedience. He did not mention the dog's name, only the standard description. Male 5-year shepherd mix prior incidents, which is how you talk when you're trying not to say what matters most. In the den behind him, a black and white photograph leaned against a brass lamp, a skinny boy with a crooked grin and a long-eared hound named Duke. The edges of the photo had worn to velvet. Sometimes, when the night settled and the house stopped creaking, he traced the crease down the middle, the one that split the boy from the dog. He had money. He had land. He had staff who watched him the way a good platoon watches its captain. What he didn't have was an answer for the one pair of amber eyes in the far kennel that would not soften. The animal had come to him after a chain of owners and bad guesses. Somewhere along that chain something had snapped. The dog didn't bite at first. He braced, bristled, sent warning like thunder 13 miles away. Then a stranger reached too fast, and it was over in a second that everyone remembered longer than they wanted. Harrison had paid the bills, settled the claims, increased safety protocols until the estate felt armored. It didn't matter. Every safeguard only proved the simple fact nothing had been mended. He lifted the notice, felt the grain of the paper. A reward was printed there, a number that would fetch headlines, but the older man didn't care for the sound of it. Money made a crowd, it didn't make a cure. Still, he set the prize high, because the world trusted numbers more than it trusted an old man's word, and because he needed to draw from the giant country that sprawled beyond his fences the one person who could read silence better than instructions. He pinned the notice to the courthouse board in town himself and sent a clean copy to the local paper. He did not speak to the reporter, only tipped his hat, then drove back on the county road where a rusted windmill turned slow as a clock that had finally decided to be honest. By morning, the phones rang with voices that sounded confident even through static. Trainers recited credentials. Behaviorists asked about temperament scales. A woman from Arizona promised a miracle program and offered testimonials you could almost see laminated. A few called with simple hunger in their words. No skills, just a belief that luck might cut them a slice. Harrison listened, said, "Thank you, set appointments." He set rules, too. No cameras, no shouting. Nothing that would leave bruises on a spirit already purpled. The staff posted the sign-in sheet at the service gate and parked an extra water cooler under the shade pecan. Word spread the old-fashioned way. Coffee shop, feed store, church steps the line at the DMV. braiding itself with the online chatter until what began as an announcement turned into a rumor with boots on. Town kids talked about the prize like a short-lived comet. Older folks spoke low as if the dog could hear through the hills. On the second afternoon, a pickup from San Antonio rattled up a man with forearms like bridge cables and a smile that stayed on only because he'd decided it would. He shook hands, said all the right sentences, and when he walked the fence line, you could see a little doubt hitch in his stride where the animal's shadow reached the sun. The next day, a woman in a clean white polo clipboard against her ribs as if it were a shield asked to review prior incident footage. Harrison declined, and she nodded in a way that said she'd expected him to. In the evenings, the owner made slow circuits of the kennels, speaking to each dog by name and tone, rather than words pausing last at the far run. He didn't step too close, didn't pretend to be a hero. He only stood where the animal could see him breathe. If he closed his eyes, he could hear his father's porch in Oklahoma, a radio playing the ball game Duke's Paws on the boards, the weight of a day before life complicated, before he learned how easy it was to buy 1,000 solutions and never find the right one. The challenge was printed bold, but in his bones it was quiet. Help me reach what I can't. Help me tell this creature he's not alone. Late on a Friday, when the clouds stacked up like freight cars and the air warned of a storm that might not arrive, a figure appeared at the service road, small against the metal cattle guard. She walked as if distance weren't an argument, sneakers scuffed to gray, a backpack puckered at the seams where someone's careful hands had once stitched it back together. The closer she came, the more the guard could make out the facts that don't show up in paperwork. How she took off her cap before she spoke, how she faced the man's shoulder rather than his eyes, how her voice sounded like a creek whispering under fallen leaves. "Sir, I heard you were looking for help," she said. The guard leaned, saw no truck behind her, no parent coming from the dust. "You with somebody?" he asked, gentle but firm. She shook her head. "Just me." She was 12, maybe, though hunger plays tricks with math. Her name was Lily. She did not look past him toward the shining house or the big sign with the prize number. She looked at the fence where the wind made a soft, metallic song. "I'm not here for the money," she said, and there was nothing performative in it. No dramatic pause, just a statement you could set on a table and it would sit there alike at dawn or dusk. The guard hesitated, radio crackling at his hip. He had been told to turn away the unqualified, to point them toward town with a list of shelters and a paper cup of water. But procedure is a careful thing, and sometimes a child's calm touches the part of you that remembers your own mornings before you learn to hurry. He asked if she was lost. She said no. He asked how she got there. "I walked," she answered, as if that were the most ordinary sentence in the world. When he asked why, she took a breath, not nervous so much as steadying. "Because sometimes animals won't listen unless you've been quiet like them," she said, and if the day had been brighter, he might have smiled. He radioed the house. "Upstairs in the den, Mr." Harrison stood with the old photograph in his hands and listened to the guard's low explanation. There was a pause long enough for a man to decide against himself. Then the owner said, "Let her stay at the gate a while, the way you might say, let the bread rise, trusting time to do what orders can't." The clouds kept their distance. The evening cool crept down the slope. The girl set her backpack on the gravel and, without asking, took a seat by the fence post, back straight, palms open on her knees, as if she were telling the land she meant no harm. Across the grounds, in the far run, something lifted its head and watched the slow, patient figure who had come without bargaining. The way you watch a word you haven't heard in years and realize you still remember its syllables. The guard who first spotted Lily at the cattle gate was a man named Robert Clay, a veteran who had traded combat boots for a pressed uniform and mirrored sunglasses. He had seen men come through those gates with ambition shining like brass on their words, and he knew the look of people chasing numbers. When he leaned down and asked the girl her business, he expected a rehearsed speech about skill or need. Maybe even desperation thinly veiled his courage. Instead, Lily tilted her chin just enough to be heard and said plainly, "I don't care about the money, sir." Robert studied her face through the reflection of his own lenses, saw dirt on her cheeks, a stubborn calm in her eyes, and the way her fingers rested steady against the strap of her bag, as though she had trained herself not to fidget. He told her that the challenge was not meant for children, that the estate could not permit her inside, and that she should head back to town before nightfall. He expected tears or pleading or anger, but Lily only nodded once, thanked him for listening, and sat back down on the gravel beside the gatepost. By dusk, the sky turned the color of rusted copper, and Robert made one more pass before his shift ended. The girl had not moved far, only adjusted her backpack into a pillow and drawn her knees under her sweatshirt. When he told her again she could not stay, she said quietly, "I will not cause trouble, sir. I will wait here." There was no stubbornness, sharpened into defiance, only a certainty that made him uncomfortable, the kind that belonged to people who had already learned how little the world gave them. He left her there, thinking she might leave once the coyotes began their song in the brush. But at sunrise, when the estate was waking to the sound of engines and the smell of coffee, she was still there. One of the handlers driving in slowed his truck, saw her rubbing her hands for warmth, and carried the story into the break room. By noon, 3 gardeners knew, and by evening the kitchen staff whispered it over clattering pans. The girl at the gate, they said, passing it like a riddle. Each man and woman added their own slant. Some thought she was chasing the prize, but too shy to admit it. Some believed she was lost, and a few shrugged and said she would vanish by the weekend. The weekend came, and Lily did not vanish. Robert tried again this time, sterner, telling her the estate was private property and she needed to move along. She listened respectfully, even stood as though she might obey. But when he turned his back, she sat down once more. That evening he found her curled against the fence post, thin jacket zipped up to her chin, backpack tucked beneath her head. The wind cut sharp through the grass, and he thought of his own daughter, grown and gone to college, safe in a dormitory, while this stranger's child slept on gravel without complaint. He brought her a paper cup of water, wordlessly set it beside her, and walked away. She whispered a thank you he pretended not to hear. On the 3rd day, the staff had begun inventing excuses to check the gate. A groundskeeper left a half sandwich on the post, and when he returned later it was gone. The cook's assistant carried out an apple wrapped in a napkin and left it without comment. Lily accepted each offering with the quiet dignity of someone who knew kindness was fragile and rare, never once begging for more. What startled them most was her composure. She did not shout to be let in, did not pound the bars, did not declare entitlement. She simply waited, morning after morning, her hair tangled by the wind, her shoes scuffed through at the toes, her gaze steady on the land beyond the fence. Mr. Harrison had not yet come down himself, but he had heard. Staff members mentioned the child in cautious tones, unsure whether he would consider her presence a nuisance or a sign. He listened without reply, his jaw set, his eyes turning toward the far kennel where Rex paced. The old man said nothing, but at night he found himself pausing by the study window, looking out toward the gate lantern where a small shadow sat unmoving as though carved from patience. By the 4th dawn, Robert radioed the main house. "Sir, the girl's still here. She doesn't leave. She says she wants to help." Static filled the pause long enough for Robert to feel he had overstepped. Then Mr. Harrison's voice came low and final. "Let her wait. We'll see if she means it." Robert slipped the radio back on his belt and turned his eyes toward the child who stood facing the sunrise as if she had been waiting for that command all her life. Each hour she stayed, the rumor grew. A few of the younger stable hands whispered that maybe she was braver than the rest of them. Others worried she was out of her mind. Yet none could deny the strangeness of it, a girl too young for contracts, too poor for schemes, sitting watch like a sentinel on the edge of land she did not own. The longer she remained, the less anyone believed it was about the money. Something else kept her there, and though no one could name it, the knowledge began to settle like dust in their throats. The morning she was finally allowed through the gate arrived without ceremony, carried on the hush of dawn and the slow rumble of pickup trucks entering the service road. The staff had grown used to her quiet presence, some even protective of it, but when word came from Mr. Harrison himself that the girl could be brought closer to the kennels, silence settled over the grounds. Robert Clay walked her down the gravel path with a steady pace, his hand never straying far from the radio at his belt. He had seen Rex's temper firsthand, seen the chain snap taut like a whip, seen teeth flash in warning that left grown men stepping back. Yet when he looked at Lily, he did not see fear. He saw the same steady calm that had kept her at the gate for days without complaint. She carried nothing in her hands, not even food, only the worn backpack strapped across her shoulders, and the determination of someone who had already passed a different kind of trial. At the far run, Rex waited. The shepherd's coat gleamed black and gray in the early light, muscles tense under the hide ears, pointed like knives of intention. The handlers had tethered him to the reinforced post, giving just enough chain to pace, but not enough to leap. His eyes burned with suspicion, and his growl vibrated low, warning any approach. The men who had tried before had come with leashes with commands with treats held out like bargaining chips. None had lasted long. The scars on his muzzle told their own history not only of battles fought, but of trust lost. Now he stood shoulders rigid, chest expanding with each breath, watching the girl who dared come closer. Robert guided Lily to the edge of the safety line, but she stepped forward until only the length of chain separated her from danger. The handlers shifted uncomfortably, whispering warnings under their breath, but Lily did not acknowledge them. She lowered herself to the ground with a slow, deliberate motion, folding her legs beneath her hands resting open on her knees. She did not speak. She did not gesture. She simply sat, as if she had come not to control but to share the earth at his feet. Rex reacted with sudden force, lunging against the chain jaws, snapping in the air, a guttural bark breaking across the field. Dust lifted under his paws as he pulled and strained, testing the limits of steel. Any other child would have flinched, any adult might have shouted or stepped back, but Lily remained still. Her eyes did not lock onto his in challenge. Instead, she kept her gaze soft-angled slightly downward, allowing him the space to rage without confrontation. The dog circled, pacing the arc allowed by the tether, ears twitching, tail stiff. His growls rose and fell like thunder retreating over hills, but he did not strike forward again. Minutes stretched long. The handlers counted breaths, certain each second might be the one when his temper boiled over. Yet Lily remained steady, breathing slow, her small frame balanced as though she had all the time in the world. The sun climbed higher, painting the grass in pale gold, and still she did not move. Gradually, Rex's snarls faltered, replaced by restless panting. He stopped at the farthest edge of the chain, turned his head toward her, then away, then back again. His muscles rippled with indecision, but the attack did not come. Instead, he prowled a slow circle, eyes fixed on her tail, dropping slightly from its rigid line. He was not relaxed, but he was no longer at war. For the first time in months, he hesitated, unsure whether this silent figure before him was an enemy to fight, or something else entirely. The staff whispered nervously, some insisting they should pull her back, others frozen by the sight of what they could not quite understand. Mr. Harrison stood apart from them, arms folded, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp. He did not call her away. He did not give orders. He watched with the gravity of a man who had gambled more than money on this moment. He saw the way Rex's steps grew slower, how his ears flicked not in alarm but in curiosity, how the fierce line of his back softened just enough to notice. Lily's breathing matched the rhythm of stillness, her shoulders loose, her presence a calm anchor in the charged air. She did not force connection, did not demand trust. She allowed the silence between them to grow, and within that silence, Rex found nothing to push against. The dog's panting slowed. His head tilted once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture before he stopped pacing. He planted his paws firmly in the dirt, eyes locked on her, and then, against every expectation, he stood still. No command had been spoken, no trick employed yet. The distance between threat and surrender narrowed. For the first time since the challenge began, Rex chose observation over violence. He stared at the girl, measuring her not as prey or foe, but as a presence he did not yet know how to name. And Lily, still as stone, gave him the one gift no one else had offered: the right to decide without pressure. The handlers held their breath. The guard tightened his grip on the radio, and Mr. Harrison, though his jaw remained set, felt a crack of memory slip through an echo of a long-ago afternoon when a boy had sat beside a dog named Duke and found safety in nothing more complicated than company. The field was hushed, the only sound the faint rattle of Rex's chain as he shifted from paw to paw, eyes burning with suspicion, body tight with energy that had nowhere to go. The handlers stood ready, their hands twitching near the safety latches, their nerves stretched as taut as the tether that held the dog back. They had seen enough near misses to know how quickly a calm moment could collapse into danger, and none of them wanted to explain to the owner why a child had been harmed under their watch. Yet in the midst of this tension, Lily remained unmoving. Her small figure settled in the grass with the steadiness of a stone that had endured weather for years. She did not issue a command or attempt to lure Rex with her voice. Instead, after long minutes of silence, she shifted slightly, not forward but downward, lowering her shoulders in the faintest gesture of humility. Her hands, which had rested loosely on her knees, turned palms upward in a subtle opening that invited without demanding. It was such a small action that most watching barely noticed, but Rex did. His ears twitched, his growl faltered, and his pacing broke for a heartbeat. The sudden pause was not submission, not trust, but it was the first time his rhythm had been interrupted by anything other than anger. He blinked a slow, uncertain movement, and his tail dropped from its rigid height into something closer to neutrality. It was not a wag, not a sign of joy, but it was no longer the stiff banner of defense. For the men who had wrestled with his rage for months, that tiny shift was almost unthinkable. One of the younger handlers swore under his breath, signaling with his hand to pull the girl back. Another reached for the catch-pole, his face pale. They saw the momentary stillness as the perfect chance to end the session safely, to claim a small victory before disaster struck. But as they began to move, a voice cut through the tension firm and low. "Stand down," Mr. Harrison said, his arms still crossed, but his gaze sharp enough to pin them in place. Not yet. The handlers froze, uncertain, but the authority in his tone left no room for argument. Rex resumed pacing, but slower now, as though something in him wrestled with the old instincts. He glanced toward Lily again, expecting challenge, yet found none. Her eyes were lowered, her breathing, even her posture, open. She made no attempt to touch the ground between them or to shorten the space. She gave him room to consider her presence rather than react to it. In that fragile gap, the air seemed to change. The men along the fence whispered nervously, but Harrison heard none of it. His mind was elsewhere, caught between memory and the present. He remembered Duke's eyes when he was a boy, how trust had not been earned through treats or tricks, but through the quiet hours spent side by side watching sunsets from a wooden porch. He had nearly forgotten what it meant to be accepted without demand, and now, watching the girl mirror that same patience, something deep in him recognized the truth. Rex stopped again, his body angled half toward her, half away, as if caught between two roads. He gave a short huff, not the growl of threat, but the exhale of confusion. Lily responded not with movement, but with stillness. She did not flinch, did not smile, did not try to close the distance. She let the moment belong to him, and that was the difference. The handlers fidgeted, their nerves straining under the silence, but Harrison raised one hand slightly, a quiet command to remain still. He could see what they could not. The dog's tension was bending, not snapping. Something was breaking loose, but it was not fury. It was fear slowly unraveling in the face of a child who refused to force it away. Rex's pacing shrank to a smaller circle. His tail flicked once, uncertain, then settled low. He licked his lips in anxious habit, then sat suddenly, almost awkwardly, as though surprised by his own choice. A ripple moved through the handlers' disbelief plain on their faces. Harrison did not move his jaw tight, his heart pounding in a way he would not show. He knew this was not victory, not even close. It was a crack in the wall, a hairline fracture in months of hostility, and it had been made not by training or power, but by the quiet persistence of a child who had nothing but patience to offer. Lily exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing just a fraction, though her gaze remained soft and lowered. She had not broken him, had not tried to. She had only waited long enough for him to feel the weight of his own choice. The dog's eyes stayed on her, not with warmth, but with something less dangerous than before: curiosity, faint and tentative. The handlers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to hope or to fear. Harrison stepped closer, his boots crunching on gravel, not enough to draw attention, but enough to claim the moment as his own. He knew this was the beginning of something neither money nor reputation could buy. For the first time in years, he felt the thin edge of possibility cut through the heavy air of failure. He did not smile, but his hand tightened around the brim of his hat in a gesture that betrayed the smallest spark of hope. The handlers kept their eyes fixed on Rex, waiting for the inevitable snap of jaws that would prove this fragile calm an illusion. But what came instead was silence, stretched thin over the field. Lily sat steady, her posture relaxed but not careless, her small hands resting gently on her knees. She had not moved since Rex had chosen to sit, and the stillness between them began to feel less like a standoff and more like a truce. One of the staff muttered that she should try offering him a command, but Lily's head lifted just slightly, and her voice, though soft, carried clearly enough for all of them to hear. "I'm not here to train him," she said. "I just want to sit with him." Her words landed heavier than expected, not dramatic, not sharp, only sincere. The handlers shifted uncomfortably, unused to hearing such a simple answer. Training was their language: obedience, their measure of success, but this child spoke of companionship as if it were enough. Even Harrison, standing behind the line, felt the weight of her words sink into places he had long kept closed. Rex tilted his head at the sound of her voice ears flicking forward. He had bristled against commands before, had met every sharp tone with sharper resistance, but this was different. The cadence of Lily's voice held no demand, no hidden test, just the warmth of someone willing to remain without conditions. He rose slowly from where he had sat, paws pressing into the dirt, and padded a few steps closer within the limit of his chain. His body stayed tense, but his growl had faded into a low hum, more uncertain than threatening. His amber eyes stayed fixed on her face, reading her not as an adversary, but as a puzzle he could not yet solve. The men along the fence exchanged wary looks. Some believed it was only a matter of time before his instincts took hold again. Others were unsettled by the sight of a beast so notorious choosing hesitation over hostility. Harrison's jaw tightened, his heart steady but fast as he studied the pair. He could not recall the last time Rex had quieted in the presence of anyone, least of all a stranger. Yet here was a girl with nothing to offer but stillness, creating a breach in the fortress of rage no expert had managed to dent. Lily did not press the moment further. She let Rex take his steps without answering with movement of her own. When the shepherd huffed, once ears twitching, she whispered a reply so soft the handlers strained to catch it. "You don't have to do anything for me. I'm just here." The words were not for them, but for the dog. and they carried an ease that struck deeper than they realized. Rex gave another uncertain whine, a sound that startled those who had only known him through growls. It was not affection, not yet, but it was not defiance either. Robert Clay felt the hairs on his arms rise. He had seen war dogs and strays, had witnessed the hardened edges of fear carved into muscle and bone, but he had never seen one pause like this at the voice of a child. He glanced at Harrison, waiting for a signal, but the older man remained still, his eyes fixed on the quiet exchange. Rex edged closer, his chain clinking lightly with each step, until the space between him and the girl was no more than a few feet. He did not lunge, did not bare his teeth. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring as if testing the air around her. Lily did not reach out, did not dare to touch. She only whispered again, steady and calm, her voice carrying the gentleness of someone who knew what it was like to be feared. The shepherd exhaled heavily, a rough sigh that seemed pulled from deep within, and for the first time his body language loosened, shoulders easing from their rigid hold. The handlers were bewildered, whispering to one another about how impossible it was, but Lily did not look their way. She stayed focused on Rex, her expression serene, her presence unshaken. The shepherd circled once, slow and deliberate, as though measuring the boundaries of this strange new arrangement. His tail, once a stiff rod of warning, now gave the faintest shift, not wagging but alive with something different from aggression. Harrison stepped closer to the rail, his boots crunching lightly on gravel. He could feel the disbelief of his staff radiating around him, but his attention remained on the girl and the dog. He thought of the photograph in his study of Duke, resting his chin on the boy's knee, of a trust that had never been taught but simply grown. Watching Rex hesitate, watching him search the air for meaning in a child's voice, Harrison felt the stirrings of a memory he had buried. The moment held delicate as glass, with everyone afraid to breathe too loudly. Lily shifted just slightly enough to make her voice carry again. "It's all right," she said, almost a whisper, yet clear. "You don't have to be angry all the time." Rex's ears twitched, and though no one could explain why, the harshness in his posture eased further. He gave a low chuff, a sound almost resembling curiosity, and then stood watching her, not with rage but with something older, something quieter, as though he had remembered a long-lost comfort and could not quite name it. The first true breakthrough came on a morning wrapped in the pale gold of late summer, when Rex finally lay down beside Lily without growling. He had not become gentle overnight, but the sharp edges of hostility that had defined him were duller now, replaced by a tentative curiosity that even the staff could not ignore. Mr. Harrison stood at the fence, his eyes fixed on the sight of the great shepherd resting with his muzzle inches from the girl's shoes, and something inside him shifted. The handlers did not speak. They knew they were witnessing the impossible made ordinary by the patience of a child who owned nothing but her silence. Later that day, Harrison called Lily into the main house. She followed Robert Clay down the wide hall with its oak-paneled walls and portraits of hunting dogs that seemed to watch her every step. Rex padded quietly behind, allowed for the first time into the house under Harrison's order, though every handler thought it madness. When they reached the study, Harrison stood at the large desk, a leather-bound ledger open before him, a check already signed with the figure that had sparked so many calls and inquiries. He held it out to her, his hand steady, his eyes sharper than his voice. "You earned this," he said simply. $1 million as promised." The room fell silent as Lily looked at the paper. She stared at it for several long seconds, her small face unreadable, then slowly shook her head. "I don't want it," she said. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples across every heart in the room. Robert blinked. The handlers glanced at one another, and even Rex lifted his head as if sensing the weight of the moment. Harrison narrowed his eyes, not in anger but in disbelief. "You do not want it?" he asked, his tone measured. Lily stood straighter, her voice calm, though her hands were folded tightly in front of her. "I don't need money, sir," she said. "I need a place where I can stay without being told to leave. I need food 2 meals a day, not fancy, just enough. And I want to go to school." The request was so small, so unadorned, that it struck the room harder than any demand for riches could have. The handlers, who had expected her to vanish with her fortune, were silent, now their faces softened by something close to shame. Robert shifted his weight, his throat tightening at the simple dignity of the girl's plea. Rex pressed closer to her leg, his eyes steady, his body language protective as if he understood her words. Harrison studied her for a long time, his brow furrowed. He had offered the greatest sum most men would ever dream of, and yet she had asked for what most children were given without thought. The truth of it cracked through the walls he had built around himself, because he saw in her request not greed but survival. She was not chasing wealth. She was reaching for a life she had been denied. He closed the ledger, set the check down, and leaned his hands on the desk, his voice low. "That is all you want?" She nodded once, steady, her eyes clear, though her lips trembled faintly at the corners. "That's all." The silence stretched long. A clock ticked on the mantel, each sound sharp in the stillness. At last Harrison straightened his shoulders, lifting as though bearing a weight both heavy and necessary. "Then you will have it," he said. The words were plain, but their impact was profound. The handlers exhaled. Robert closed his eyes briefly, and Rex settled again at Lily's feet, his tail giving the faintest sweep across the carpet. Harrison walked around the desk, his footsteps firm, and placed a hand gently on the girl's shoulder. "You will have a room here in this house," he continued. "You will eat at my table. And tomorrow, we will see to it that you are enrolled in school." Lily's shoulders eased for the first time in years, though she did not weep or exclaim. She simply nodded, her composure intact, her calm as steady as it had been at the gate. Yet her eyes shone with something fragile and new relief. The handlers turned away, some embarrassed by their own emotions, while Robert found himself gripping the brim of his cap tightly as if holding back the swell of his heart. Harrison released her shoulder and stepped back, his expression unreadable to most, but inside he felt the echo of Duke of Trust once lost and now faintly remembered. He realized the challenge had never truly been about the dog nor the prize. It had been about finding someone who could show both man and beast that brokenness did not mean the end. Lily had asked for so little, but in her humility she had given him more than he had thought possible. The evening that followed was quiet. Lily was shown to a room upstairs, simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the fields. She touched the quilt with reverence, as if it were treasure, and whispered a soft thank you no one heard. Rex lay outside her door, ears twitching, watchful, already bound to her by a loyalty that needed no training. Harrison lingered in the hallway longer than he meant to, watching the scene unfold, the photograph of Duke heavy in his thoughts. He turned away at last, his step slow, but for the first time in decades, the weight in his chest felt lighter. The first morning in her new room began with the scent of lavender still clinging to the quilt, and the strange sensation of waking in a bed rather than on concrete. Lily sat upright, slowly blinking against the light filtering through the small window, her fingers brushing the sheets as if to confirm they were real. At the foot of her door lay Rex, stretched long across the hall, his head lifting the instant she stirred. His amber eyes caught the light, and his tail swept once across the floorboards, not wild with excitement, but steady, the quiet thump of recognition. He rose and padded after her when she opened the door, shadowing her steps with the kind of devotion that none of the staff could believe belonged to the same creature who had once lunged at them with lethal force. By the time she reached the kitchen, Rex had settled himself by her chair, a silent guardian watching every move. The cook raised an eyebrow but said nothing, sliding a plate of eggs and toast across the counter. Lily murmured her thanks. her voice shy yet sincere, and broke the toast into small pieces that Rex watched carefully without growling a patience the staff found more unsettling than aggression. Wherever she went that day, whether down the hall or across the lawn, Rex followed. The gardeners paused in their trimming. The stable hands lowered their tools, each one staring as the feared dog walked calmly behind the girl, ears flicking at every sound, body alert but not hostile. It was not training they saw. It was something harder to explain, a bond grown not through command, but through quiet presence. Harrison noticed it too. He watched from the porch as Lily crossed the yard with Rex at her side, her small frame dwarfed by the shepherd yet strangely secure within his orbit. He had once believed the dog could never be trusted, that his estate would always carry the shadow of that unbroken hostility. Now he saw trust blooming in a form that did not need words. That evening, when Lily set her backpack on the porch and looked at him with those calm, steady eyes, Harrison felt something stir, not just hope for the dog, but for himself. The following morning he woke earlier than usual, long before the staff prepared the kitchen. He stood in front of the counter, awkwardly unsure of where the pans were kept, yet determined. His hands, more used to contracts and ledgers, fumbled with eggs and a skillet. The bacon curled unevenly. The toast came out darker than he intended, but he set the plate on the table with a quiet pride. When Lily came down the stairs, hair tangled from sleep, she stopped short at the sight of him waiting by the table. He cleared his throat, suddenly self-conscious. "Figured you ought to start your day with something warm," he said. She blinked, then smiled, not wide, but enough to light her tired face. "Thank you," she whispered, and the gratitude in her voice struck deeper than any praise he had ever earned in boardrooms or on magazine covers. He did not tell the staff what he had done. He did not even admit it to himself fully. But the next morning he was at the stove again, his hands steadier. This time his mind already forming a routine he had not planned to create. Lily accepted each meal with quiet appreciation, and Rex sat faithfully at her feet, his head resting on his paws, watching every exchange as if guarding the fragile thread tying them together. Days passed, and the change became visible to all who worked the estate. The once reclusive billionaire now shared coffee on the porch with a child, his paper folded neatly beside her plate. He asked her about the books she had found in the study, listened as she stumbled through words she did not know, and gently corrected her pronunciation with patience no one had ever seen in him. The staff exchanged looks, marveling at how the man who once spoke only of efficiency and order now paused to help a girl sound out words, his stern voice softening at her effort. Rex's devotion deepened each day. He trailed Lily as she explored the grounds, his posture protective whenever strangers approached. A delivery driver once walked too close, and Rex stiffened a warning growl rumbling deep in his chest. But when Lily touched his back and whispered, "It's all right," the growl melted into silence. That moment traveled quickly through the staff like wildfire. The feared dog obeyed not commands but comfort, bending not to force but to trust. Harrison saw more than anyone. He saw how Rex's loyalty mirrored his own longing, how Lily's presence filled corners of the house that had grown hollow with time. He began leaving small things for her, a folded blanket on the couch, a notebook on the desk in her room, a glass of milk poured before she even asked. Each gesture was subtle, almost accidental, yet each revealed a man rediscovering the instincts of care he had long buried. At night he still held the photograph of Duke, but now he stared less at the crease dividing boy and dog, and more at the memory of belonging it represented. What startled him most was how natural it felt. The routines that once bound him, meetings, investments, endless negotiations, had been replaced by smaller rituals, a breakfast made by his own hands, a walk across the fields with Lily and Rex, a pause at the porch as the sun went down. They were simple acts, but they carried the weight of something larger, something he had believed lost forever. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that almost felt ordinary. Lily woke early sometimes before the staff and Rex waited faithfully outside her door. His body stretched across the threshold as if he were the lock itself. Together they walked. The Halls stepped onto the porch to breathe the cool morning air and wandered the edges of the estate where the fences met the horizon. To those who watched, it seemed as though a balance had finally been found. The child secure, the dog transformed. The master softened into something resembling peace. Yet peace, as Harrison knew well, was fragile, and the test came without warning. It was late afternoon when the storm broke, not of thunder but of instinct. One of the maintenance men, a newcomer unfamiliar with the estate's history, carried a toolbox down the hall where Lily and Rex happened to be. The lid of the box slipped clattering loudly onto the tiles, sending a metallic echo that bounced like gunfire in the narrow space. Rex reacted in an instant, hackles raised, teeth flashing as he lunged forward with a growl that shook the air. The man dropped the box and stumbled back, panic widening his eyes. The handlers who had been nearby shouted, rushing in with catch-poles and orders, their voices rising in fear. The hallway filled with chaos, but Lily did not scream. She stepped forward quickly, her small hand pressing lightly against Rex's shoulder, her voice cutting through the noise. "It's all right," she whispered, the same calm tone she had used from the beginning. The shepherd froze mid-stride, his growl breaking into a choked whine. He looked back at her eyes flicking between fear and recognition, and slowly, painfully, his body eased. His jaws closed, his muscles softened, and he sank back onto his haunches, chest heaving with the effort of restraint. The handlers froze in disbelief, their poles raised but unused. The man pressed against the wall, shaken but unharmed, staring at the dog who only moments ago had seemed a force of violence. Harrison arrived moments later, his footsteps heavy on the floor, his eyes sharp as he took in the scene. For an instant, the old reflex rose in him, the urge to order the dog removed to protect his people, to bury the problem beneath control. But then his gaze fell on Lily, still standing with her hand steady on Rex's shoulder, her calm presence holding the animal together when nothing else could. He saw in her eyes no fear, no demand, only trust, and in Rex's eyes he saw not malice but confusion, the ghost of old wounds triggered by sound and movement. He raised a hand sharply when one handler began to speak. "No," Harrison said, his voice firm but even. "Do not punish him." The words stunned the room. The handlers had expected condemnation, another round of debates about danger and liability. Instead, Harrison stepped closer, his boots clicking against the tiles, his face lined but resolute. "He is not broken," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving the shepherd. "He only remembers what hurt him." The silence that followed was heavier than the noise that had come before. The handlers lowered their poles, uncertain, and the maintenance man nodded shakily, relieved, yet puzzled. Rex remained still beneath Lily's touch, his body trembling but his eyes calmer now, anchored by her steady voice. For the first time, Harrison stood openly between the world and the dog, not as master demanding obedience, but as guardian offering understanding. He turned to the staff, his expression sharp. "From this day forward, we will not treat him as a danger waiting to strike," he said. "We will treat him as one of our own who needs trust to heal." The handlers exchanged glances, some skeptical, some moved, but none dared oppose him. That evening, when the house quieted and the storm of nerves had passed, Harrison found himself lingering at the kitchen doorway. Lily sat at the table with a sandwich, Rex lying at her feet, his body curled tight, but his eyes soft as they watched her. She looked up at Harrison, not smiling but steady, as if to say without words that this was the proof he needed. He stepped inside, poured himself a cup of coffee, and for the first time addressed the dog directly without tension in his voice. "You did well," he said simply. Rex's ears twitched, and though he could not understand the words, the tone carried enough. He lowered his head back onto his paws and closed his eyes as if surrendering to the safety of the room. Harrison leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on the unlikely pair. He realized then that the challenge he had issued months before had already been answered, though not in the way he imagined. It was not about making Rex obedient or proving dominance. It was about showing him, and perhaps himself, that trust was still possible, even after years of fear. He thought again of Duke of Afternoons long gone, and for the first time in years, the memory brought not pain, but peace. The evening after Rex's outburst passed with unusual quiet. The staff went about their routines more softly than usual, their voices low in the hallways, as if the house itself needed rest from the weight of what had happened. Lily finished her supper at the kitchen table, her hands folded politely in her lap until Harrison dismissed her with a nod. She rose with Rex at her side and climbed the narrow staircase to her room. Hours later, long after the staff had gone to their quarters and the lights of the estate had dimmed, Harrison found himself pacing the hall outside her door. In his hand he held the photograph of Duke, its edges worn from decades of being turned over in sleepless nights. The memory of Rex lunging earlier that day replayed in his mind. Yet alongside it came the image of the girl's small hand pressed against the dog's shoulder, steadying him with nothing but presence. It was a kind of courage he could not name. He was about to retreat to his study when the door opened slightly and Lily's face appeared in the sliver of lamplight. "Mr. Harrison," she said softly, her voice carrying none of the hesitation most children used when speaking to adults. He paused, surprised, then inclined his head. "You should be sleeping," he said. She stepped into the hall barefoot, Rex rising behind her to stand guard as always. "I can't sleep," she admitted. Her eyes were calm, but there was a weight behind them, something long held back. He gestured toward the parlor at the end of the hall, and together they walked there in silence, the dog's claws clicking lightly against the wooden floor. They sat opposite each other. Harrison in his worn leather chair, Lily on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The lamplight painted shadows across her face, making her seem both younger and older at once. For a while neither spoke. Finally she drew in a breath and said, "I need to tell you why I came." Harrison waited, his eyes steady on hers. "It wasn't for the contest," she continued. "It wasn't for money. I heard about Rex, how nobody could reach him, and I thought maybe I could try, because I know what it feels like to be unwanted." Her voice did not tremble, but each word carried a quiet force that settled heavily in the room. Harrison felt the air shift inside him as though her words had struck a hidden chord. He had expected gratitude, perhaps curiosity, but not this confession. He opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, letting her continue. "When people look at Rex, they see danger. When people looked at me, they saw trouble or nothing at all. I used to think if I stayed quiet enough, maybe someone would notice. But no one did. Not until now." She glanced down, her fingers twisting together, and Rex nudged her knee gently with his muzzle, as if reminding her she was no longer alone. Harrison leaned back, the photograph of Duke heavy in his pocket. Her words echoed with a truth he could not ignore. He remembered his own childhood after his father's death, the long stretches of silence in a house that felt too big, the sense of being overlooked despite having everything money could buy. Later, as a man, he had buried himself in business, convincing himself that isolation was strength. Yet here was a girl laying bare the same wound one he had hidden behind walls of wealth and distance. He realized then that Rex was not the only one who had needed saving. He himself had been living behind chains, invisible, but just as strong. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than he intended. "You came here because you understood him," he said. Lily nodded, her gaze lifting to meet his. "I understood what it's like when people stop trying. I didn't want him to feel that way anymore." The honesty of her words struck him deeper than any lecture or therapy ever had. He looked at her, not as a guest, not as a child he had taken in out of obligation, but as a mirror reflecting his own unspoken grief. For the first time in years, Harrison felt his composure waver. He rubbed his hand over his jaw, staring at the girl who had walked onto his land with nothing and given back something he had thought was lost. "You're braver than you know," he said finally, his tone carrying a weight of respect. She shook her head. "Not brave, just tired of being invisible." The simplicity of her answer cut through him because he understood it far too well. They sat in silence again, but it was not the heavy silence of loneliness. It was the softer kind, the silence of two people who had confessed truths too large for words. Rex lay at their feet, eyes half closed, his breathing steady, as if he too had found peace in the company of those who understood him. Harrison reached into his pocket, pulled out the photograph of Duke, and placed it gently on the table between them. "This was my first friend," he said. Lily studied the photo, her eyes lingering on the boy's smile and the dog's steady gaze. "He looks like Rex," she whispered. Harrison nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, he was everything I needed then, just like Rex is everything you needed now." The lamplight flickered, and for the first time in decades, Harrison felt less like a man guarding memories and more like someone sharing them. He realized then that healing did not come from isolation or from wealth. It came from being seen, from being understood, from having someone sit beside you without asking for anything more. The house no longer felt like a fortress of stone and silence. It began to carry the rhythms of life that had been missing for years, rhythms too simple to notice until they returned. Lily's laughter, soft and hesitant at first, now slipped into the rooms during quiet meals, or while she stumbled over words in the books she borrowed from the study. The staff, once cautious, now greeted her in the mornings with smiles, some slipping her an apple or a pencil for school. Rex followed her without fail, his shadow and his shield moving with the certainty of a creature that had finally found where he belonged. To the people who worked the estate, it was no longer a question of whether she would stay. It had become fact as natural as the sun rising. Harrison watched the change unfold each day, discovering that the house seemed less hollow. He no longer walked past the dining room without glancing and expecting to see Lily bent over her plate, Rex's head resting on her knee. He no longer kept his study door closed, but left it ajar, knowing she might wander in to ask about a photograph or a word she did not understand. The challenge he had issued months earlier was never mentioned again. The check still lay in the drawer of his desk, untouched, irrelevant. What mattered was that Lily had not claimed a prize, but a place, and that claim was written not in ink or contract, but in the daily truth of belonging. One evening after supper, Harrison lingered by the porch as Lily carried her school books inside. The town school had accepted her enrollment without question once Harrison's name was mentioned, but he knew the true credit belonged to her. She had walked miles to his gate, faced down fear, and refused wealth for something more enduring. He watched as she paused at the top of the stairs to smile at Rex, the shepherd settling at her feet as if to say he would not leave her side. Harrison felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, not the sharpness of loss, but the gentler ache of gratitude. The staff noticed the difference in him as well. He spoke more often, his voice less clipped. He walked the grounds in the early morning with Lily and Rex, his pace slower, his posture less rigid. He began to ask after the gardeners' families, to pause and listen when the cook mentioned her son's progress in school. It was not that he had been cruel before, only distant, but the distance had lessened. The walls he had built out of grief and solitude were thinner now, and through them light entered again. That night, the house was still, the air cool with autumn's first touch. Lily's room upstairs glowed faintly with the lamplight she kept by her desk, though she had long since fallen asleep. Her school books lay open, a pencil resting where her hand had let go mid-sentence. Outside her door, Rex lay stretched across the hallway, his body blocking the entrance, his ears twitching at every sound, his eyes half closed but alert. He was not restless, not defensive, only steady, a guardian who had found peace in watching over the one person who had seen him for more than his scars. Harrison stood at the far end of the hallway, his hand resting on the banister. He did not move closer, unwilling to disturb the scene. The shepherd lying like a sentinel, the girl sleeping with her face soft against the pillow, the quiet harmony that filled the house. All of it felt fragile, precious. He leaned against the wall, the photograph of Duke once again in his hand, but tonight he did not stare at it with sorrow. Tonight he placed it gently in his pocket and let his eyes rest instead on what was before him. For the first time in decades he felt peace. It was not the peace bought by money or secured by walls, but the peace of knowing that trust once broken could grow again. He realized that Lily's courage had never been loud or forceful. It had been steady, silent, unyielding in the face of indifference. That strength had reached Rex, had reached him, had reminded them both that being unwanted did not mean being unworthy. He stood there until the clock in the parlor struck midnight, listening to the faint sounds of the house breathing around him. Then he turned and walked slowly to his own room, his steps lighter than they had been in years. He no longer needed the challenge, the prize, or even the explanation. The truth was simpler. Lily belonged here. Rex belonged here. And in their presence, he too had found where he belonged. That was Lily's story, proof that sometimes healing doesn't come from wealth, but from courage and quiet strength. What part of her journey touched you the most? Let me know in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss another story.